all of that is really just my brief introduction to our honored guest, Constance Steinkuehler, who is, I believe, just finishing up her term at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President, where she's the senior policy advisor in everything policy related to games and learning and impact. She's on leave as a faculty member at Wisconsin-Madison, where she has her own research lab called Pop Cosmo, and where she has been instrumental in establishing and bringing to recognition the Games, Learning, and Society initiative, which brings together researchers, doctoral students, scholars, etc., in design and study of interactive digital games. Her own focus is on understanding MMOs and a variety of them in terms of cultural and cognitive issues in learning with them and using them as learning environments. And she has published widely in this area. We're so fortunate to have her here. So wonderful to ask her to introduce us to what the future of our field has to bring. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience. So first I'm going to say thank you for inviting me to be here. What an amazing event. What amazing speakers as well. I sort of feel a little bit humbled putting this in the longer history and trajectory of educational technology. So my name is Constance. I am at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am a newly tenured faculty there and spent the last year working for Obama's White House advising on games. I still haven't figured out how in the world I ever got that gig, but I did it for well over a year and then resigned somewhere right around election time as I chose to go back. I have a 3- and a 5-year-old at home who I decided were more important than the president, and then resigned, and actually there's now a predecessor in the office right now named Mark Delora. So this work that I'll be talking about for a few minutes here today is actually continuing for at least the next 2 years, which I'm really excited about. How many of you are familiar with games in some respect? Play games, familiar with the landscape? Okay, a good swath of you. I'm going to start with a few basic facts because even for many of us who may game, the importance of this medium is often easily overlooked simply because we think of them as entertainment toys, as though that's somehow derogatory. But games, in fact, are part of the 21st century economy. If you just look at the amount of money that the games industry is making, you're looking at if you combine software and hardware, you have a $25.1 billion industry. Those numbers have more meaning when you put them in comparison with the other entertainment industries. So video games, for example, dwarf music. Now during my generation, I don't know about you, but we socialized and picked out our social order based on music. And this isn't to say that music doesn't play a role, but in the ecosystem of media for young people and adults, games is actually dwarfing them at this point as far as money is spent. It's also one of the fastest growing sectors of our economy. Again, as a point in comparison, if you look at 2005 to 2010, the entire US GDP grew by about 16%, while the games industry revenue actually more than doubled. So it's not simply that it's an important sector of the economy, it's that it's actually growing at a really amazing rate. So, and again, for what it's worth, more generally, there is public concern, there always has been, with youth in particular and their interaction with media. So the latest reports from Generation M, these are 2010 figures, but actually show that young people consume about 11 hours of media a day. 11 hours of media a day. If you think about how much time you spend in school, that should be impossible. But they do it by multitasking, and it's not just youth, right? My 3-year-old has this strange thing where he wants us to have a television show on the TV and then get his iPad out. Yes, my children have iPads and every other gizmo you can imagine. He likes to get it out and have it on his lap and watch a second show, which makes me absolutely crazy, right? He wants 2 shows playing at the same time. This is enough to make any mother insane. So I'm constantly resisting this. And the other day, a couple months ago, he sat down on the couch next to me and got out his iPad trying to watch 2 shows. And I'm thinking, oh no, not the dual show thing again. And then he goes, hold on, Mama, hold on. Walks over to the counter, brings over my iPad and hands it to me and goes, there you go. And I realize, oh my God, I know where my 3-year-old is getting this, because I don't sit and watch television or a movie without doing something on my iPad. Usually going through emails, not very exciting, but how many of you sit and simply watch a movie or watch television anymore? For many of us, I'm impressed. For many of us, it's simply not our media environment. We actually are multitasking all the time. So that 11 hours of media consumption is crammed into about 7.5 hours of screen time, usually through multiple screens, right? Total media use, interesting breakdowns, but remember, video games is one part of it, surely not the only important part. TV content is still way up on top, but video games, as I've pointed out, are growing. So right now, they account for about an hour and 15 minutes of youth time. When I first started studying games, that figure was about 50 minutes a day, which already dwarfed homework time. And that number has steadily risen, right? So I cut my teeth being tolerated by my school of education, who was indulgent enough to let me study things like game culture and commercial games with absolutely no intention to teach, based on the argument that I would make that, in fact, kids are learning from media, and we probably want to know what they're learning from media because that's what they bring to classrooms, right? So I was lucky enough to be in a school of education that indulged in the very notion that you've built into your very program here, that learning happens across the entire ecosystem, not merely in formal education itself, and that connecting up that learning is very important. But what in the world would the White House have to do with games, right? When I was first tapped to consider this position, I actually thought it was a joke. And then I thought, well, it must be that it's a bizarre and obscure, it was Office of Science and Technology Policy. I thought, well, maybe it's in a bizarre and obscure office in, like, I don't know, Department of Education or something, which absolutely no interest in doing, but you know how this goes. Your job is to go and to have them wish that you said yes, even though you're going to say no. So I went and I did that to DC. I got on the plane, I got out there, stayed in the hotel, next day, get a taxi, and I give them the address, and I get out, and I'm like, it's the White House. Let me check this for a second. Boop, boop, boop. I'm at the White House. What is the White House interested in games at all for? Well, it turns out, as you may have noticed, we have a very tech-savvy president. My favorite part of this image is the back of his apple. Love this man. Love it. And this has not always been the case, but in fact, the president himself is quite tech-savvy. There's precedence for their interest in games as a particular medium. For example, the First Lady has commented about DDR and its use at Camp David, teasing the president, saying he still hasn't figured out how to do it, but it's a great game, it gets your body moving. If you look at Obama's innovation strategy, it starts to make even more sense. In fact, games can be located at multiple sort of places within that innovation strategy, everything from, say, addressing grand challenges. So, for example, games that might build on our smart grid system of energy consumption across the nation. You could think about gamifying that information system to get people to decrease the amount of energy they consume in their home through nothing more than comparing them to their neighbors, right? So everything from these grand challenges all the way down to the very foundation, which includes what we do, which is building games that might actually teach young people the skills and knowledge necessary for the 21st century. Now, this handsome gentleman with gray hair that's beside the president, that is Dr. Holdren, who was my boss while working in the White House. And most of my work while there, and the work that continues now, was really focused on 3 main questions. What games should exist that don't? So what ought to be created that hasn't been created yet? How do you create an innovation ecosystem to get those games created? What would you need to get games that might delight us in amazing ideas, that might improve civic participation, that might ameliorate problems of childhood obesity, right? So, and then third, what kinds of new forms of discovery may games enable? So including in that, not only games, for example, how many of you have heard of many of the sort of crowdsourcing games like, gosh, there's a bunch. Fold It is quite popular, right? Have you heard of these games? Okay, so game-type platforms that actually pool collective problem solving as a way to generate scientific discovery. So that kind of example, all the way over to what kind of new forms of computational social science might we enable through online digital games? So those are three sort of the driving questions of the work that was going on in the White House at that time. So why games, though? Well, there are many different affordances of games in the briefs that we created about what make games a particularly interesting medium. But let me just go over three because these are the ones I care about most. First and foremost, games are an architecture for engagement. So this is one of many images from Mass Effect 3, which is a very popular and very beautiful and very riveting game right now. But games you may think of not merely as a system of rules that guide social interaction with technology or with other people, but in fact what game designers do is they build a system of engagement. They architect some sort of building type structure in order to engage people. This is why, for example, we talk about addiction when it comes to games and we don't talk about addiction when it comes to books, right? Second, the growing body of research of impact on cognition and behavior. So games for impact generally have now been found to have interesting and important results, positive results across a whole bevy of areas. So certainly in areas of scientific reasoning, historical reasoning, understanding concepts, but also neuroscience around visual acuity and attention, games that ameliorate aging and the brain, games that it can actually improve issues around, say, the spectrum of autism. And certainly health games, games that are a thin kind of interface between a patient and their data. So how many of you use something like Nike Fit or Nike Plus, right, or the Fit bands? So you see a lot of games being created that is really a way in which a user can interact with their own data and set their own goals and sort of partition their experience accordingly. So the impact on cognition and behavior has certainly been persuasive in their use nationally. I want to tell a little bit of a story of data, and these are data that came out of my research lab right before I went on leave. And this is trying to make the point that engagement matters. So we were studying, I ran a 2-year program for for young adolescent boys who hated school and loved games. If you pay much attention to literacy, it turns out that boys on average for the last 20 or 30 years read 2 grades below level, and this is standard. So we were studying some of this problem because if you think about after spending 5-7 years sort of documenting and analyzing the kind of intellectual work that games recruit when it's commercial games, then you look at performance. So boys are still the biggest swath of game players. So wouldn't you then expect that they would be doing well in school, right? Turns out they're not. Even on topics like literacy that I've spent years studying how games actually promote literacy. So we decided to tackle some of this problem. And in this particular study, I apologize, the graphic sort of shifted on me here. But we had both struggling and non-struggling readers. And we were seeing across this 2-year sort of ethnographic space that struggling readers were reading text that was college-level text in difficulty, and they were reading it with perfect comprehension and able to implement changes based on comprehension of the text in the game. Well, that's interesting because based on their reading assessments, they shouldn't be able to understand that text, right? So we decided to do a series of experiments. And the first experiment we did seemed very rational. We gave our participants a reading assessment, the QRI, and we found out their exact reading level. And then we went and literally grabbed text from their textbooks and then text from their game environment and looked to see, okay, if both texts are at your appropriate reading level, are you sort of using different strategies to read them. Would that account for the fact that you're able to read better, more, with greater comprehension and accuracy on a game-based text? So we looked for different strategies. We found absolutely nothing. No differences, no performance differences. And we thought, well, that's really strange because our struggling readers are still doing so much better with game-based text. So months passed and we decided to run the study one more time. And this time, rather than artificially deflating the level of difficulty of the text that we gave them, we decided to make it really hard text. But we did one other thing too. We said, give us 3 topics you want to read more about that's related to your game. So they did, and we ran out and we got text that was at least 12th grade, right? Meaning that our 6th grade readers had a very big challenge. It had to be at least 2 grades too hard from what they should be able to read. And a bevy of others sort of had to be of a certain level of complexity syntactically, etc. Redid the study, and lo and behold, what you found was that this difference between struggling and non-struggling readers disappeared. Suddenly, all of the students, and I don't know if you can make it on this slide, but the red highlight is showing you, so for example, we had a student that was in 11th grade, reading at the 6th grade level, who read a 14th grade text, so sophomore in college, and read with 97% accuracy, which is considered an independent reading level. So what we showed, let me see if I can state this a little more clearly, was that when they chose the topic of the text, which is to say, when they cared what they were reading, the differences between struggling and non-struggling readers disappeared. Right? So the first thing we thought, of course, was, well, maybe it's prior knowledge. They picked the topic, so an explanation would be that they know more about a topic. As you know, when you read about a topic you already know about, it's much easier. Right? So we looked for that, and there was no relationship. It turned out that when we opened up the transcripts of their readings, they were running into just as many challenges in the text, but they were actually fixing their comprehension problems on the fly. So in some ways, it's kind of a no-duh moment, right? I hope that we all sometimes as researchers have that moment. I know I certainly did. But it was this really sort of no-duh moment of it turns out that how well kids read is deeply tied to whether or not they care about what they're reading, right? So this notion that games are an architecture for engagement is actually non-trivial. Being able to engage a young learner in the topic, I would argue, is probably the fundamental goal of what an instructional piece of media should be. I'll say more about that in a minute. Finally, third affordance that gets the White House very, very excited, me too, is this notion of data exhaust. That the kinds of data that you can now get from games, you can get clickstream telemetry data from games of really interesting, depending on what activities you build in, but very interesting data. You can ask things like what choices mattered, and not just whether or not you actually knew how to take a summative exam. You can ask what is the predictive power of you failing early. You can start to talk about different types of failure. Failure that's really productive failure versus failure that's floundering. And you now see empirical studies that's able to build those arguments and do those analyses because games kick off this data exhaust that's amazing. Now this slide up here is A/B testing. The other side of that, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with A/B testing, where you simply can create 2 versions of a piece of media and literally test it on thousands of people to see which one works. Not sure what color to make your banner on a website? Roll it out randomly and see how many people click through when it's red versus blue, right? That's the logic. It's used quite often in media development, media testing, and other environments, commercial environments. But that same capacity of A/B testing means not only can you refine your media, but you can start to personalize your media. You can start to think about what kind of, let's say sequence of, what sequence of problems does better for population A versus population B. So you have this capacity to start to personalize education in a way that's really powerful. All right, wow, that really did get crazy. So a little bit about this notion of an innovation ecosystem. There are really 4 stakeholders in this universe. You have federal aid that I worked with in the White House, and that continues on today. Federal agencies, philanthropies, people who are funding that work. Let's see if it's better if no, it actually just ruined it. Okay, so people who are funding the work, games industry, most of us think about that in terms of really big studios, AAA. In fact, there's a thriving indie scene right now that's probably, in my own view, far more creative than the actual AAA big blockbusters. And then fourth, you have academics, just like the particular program run here. A few words on just the scope of what we're looking at. So for example, when I started at the White House, I did a listening tour across the agencies to find out who was investing in games and what kind of work they were investing in. And at that time, my first convening was in November a year ago, and we held it in the White House Conference Center. I had about 70 program officers across 23 agencies. When I left that office, that was at, actually the final count was 206 across 33 agencies and 4 White House offices. So that is 206 program officers investing directly in game-based interventions, treatments, or solutions to their agency's missions, which is far bigger than I think many of us actually anticipated. If you look at the breakdown of that, of course, the biggest scopes also represent the biggest budgets in the government. So really Department of Defense and Department of Health, with Department of Education being another major player in this space. Now, on the academic side, there are now almost 20 Tier 1 or Ivy League universities with some form of research and development lab in games for learning or games for impact more broadly. This is indeed the very first program where students will be able to get it on their actual transcripts, an official program on games. So I think that that's an amazing way to be located. What makes this program special? Several other things. The first one I would probably point out is simply the talent. Just thinking about the people that you have here is tremendous. And secondly, thinking about context. You're in New York. The amount of design talent you have here is incredible. And third, of course, partnerships. And the Games for Learning Institute began with, wasn't it 9 partner institutions? I don't know of any other partnership that's that big. And I am more and more convinced after working with this at a national level that that innovation ecosystem, the way that we will get beautiful and seductive and amazing educational media in the hands of children, whether it's in classrooms or in their play spaces, will be through those kinds of partnerships, right? It is very difficult to do this work solo. And now a few entreaties, and I will hand the floor over. Just a couple. So the first 3 are ones that I'm preaching to the choir here, you already know. But of course, you know, we do need better collaborations between scientists and designers. You are very lucky here to have a program that knows how to do both well. Most don't. And most would throw design out the window. So many programs end up where they, well, I can put it bluntly because it's a Saturday evening, where you end up making a crappy game and then doing a study to show how crappy your crappy game is, all right? Like that's what happens. So having a center that actually puts design squarely in front is very, very important. Second, thinking about clearer pathways to get impact games from universities where most of the work is being done to market. Universities are not good at this. Federal agencies are not good at this. Once the grant dries up, it's very hard to get a product out to market. Who pays for your marketing, right? That seems non-trivial, but when you see some of the amazing things being created at universities and then demonstrated to have that impact, you can't help but feel, as a consumer or a parent, why aren't these in people's hands right now? And part of it is simply market barrier. I think there's solvable issues, but I think we have to have programs like this that actually band together, build partnerships, and help fix the issues. The third one would be improved experimental designs, thinking more, and some of this work Jan and others have done, but getting more systematic about what kinds of aspects of games make them more powerful for some people in some contexts than others. And finally, I just want to say a few words about this. If you work in this space, I'm sure this is old news. I don't know where this came from, but the whole chocolate-covered broccoli. All right? Chocolate-covered broccoli. Yeah, I can't do a public talk about educational media without this issue of chocolate-covered broccoli coming up. which I hope that we can help throw that frame out the window. First off, I'm not in the business of pouring chocolate on top of broccoli. I'm in the business of helping you understand the amazing stuff that broccoli is already doing, right? I am there to sort of create things that actually expose people who use them to what broccoli is and does already, right? This notion that somehow games are the fun that's poured over curricular materials, it doesn't work. It's examples of the worst stuff we can create, and it's just the wrong frame. So I want us to actually just, every time that comes up, just go, no more chocolate broccoli thing. No more. No more. No more chocolate broccoli thing. We need to drop it. Now, please indulge me, because I'm going to say something very controversial here, which is going to sound crazy, because I want to talk about happiness for just 1 second. And it's tied to this chocolate broccoli problem, okay? I have had the pleasure of being involved with Richie Davidson's work, which includes things like being able to test our games with the Dalai Lama, because we're working on projects that include games that are for mindfulness, games that are for pro-social skills. And it has been really transformative to me, because over in the world of education, we don't talk about happiness. In fact, we have almost a nasty puritanical streak where we talk about things like, the happiness is the chocolate poured on my broccoli, all right? But I want to make a small plea that as we build beautiful media that are all about the amazing ideas that transform how you understand the world, whether it's mathematics and proportional reasoning, or whether it's Moby Dick, that we might think about, rather than the design of the media, the engagement of the media, the thing that makes it a seductive object being considered merely chocolate on the broccoli, I really would like us to start thinking about sort of putting happiness and joy and engagement back front and center. So I'm going to lean on Lord Richard Layer, who's an economist of amazing repute, who basically argued the other day that governments should make the happiness of the people the main outcome which they pursue. As Thomas Jefferson said, the care of human life and happiness is the only legitimate object of good government. But we have no discussion of this. We have no discussion of this in education. We have very little discussion of what kind of mathematical education would increase the happiness of the families and kids who are in our school systems. We're so busy talking about efficiency, or if you put efficiency aside, like building deep conceptual understanding, making sure we get the broccoli right, making sure we cover the standards, that we seem to have sort of lost that a general kind of premise is that increasing the happiness of young people ought to be part of what we do. And we ought to be able to do it without having to apologize or think that it's merely pouring chocolate on something. Because that is the goal. That is the goal. There are two things that most everything else in this universe can be derived out of. It's that, number one, all human beings want to be happy. And number two, that all people have an equal right to it. And that education, if we were in the business of doing that, we might be able to break out of these silly little frames like this that come from digital media. So that's my last plea, and I will hand the floor over. Thank you.